right now, let me introduce to you Dr. Ira J. Moorehead, Yazoo City, Mississippi.
Thank you, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, I will begin by asking if you happen to hear the mother who spoke to her son said, "Why did you kick your little brother in the stomach?" His answer, "He turned around." I'm glad to be here with so many who have not turned around. You have not turned out to be this group of turncoats that we run into so often. Today, it is hardly possible to scan the morning paper without having the rising cost of health care, the cruel bleeding of Medicaid by the doctors, the cesspools and fire traps called mental hospitals and nursing homes, the need to clamp down on the drug industry, the wastage in health care monies, the people who suffer from lack of proper care, and consequently the need for national health insurance beaten into one scrambled eggs. In the mid-1600s, several of the original colonies had laws to care for the indigent sick, soon after laws on quarantine. The Constitution made no mention of health, so Congress, however, was forced by a crisis of yellow fever epidemic in 1796 to pass a bill on quarantine. Congress passed a law in 1813 that required the federal government to guarantee the efficacy of cowpox vaccine and to distribute it free of charge to anyone requesting it. The American Medical Association was formally founded in 1847 in Philadelphia. The doctors now had a national organization. The AMA at first devoted its attention to medical ethics, education, and scientific matters. In 1848, it encouraged Congress to pass a law on inferior and impure drugs and medicines. The American Medical Association favored a federal Department of Health, federal legislation in support of adequate vital statistics, adequate state licensing laws, and establishment of state boards of health. In 1872, the AMA established or created a section on state medicine and hygiene. A definition of state medicine was composed for the first time, and I quote, "State medicine consists in the application of medical knowledge and skill to the benefit of communities, which is obviously a very different thing from their application to the benefit of individuals in private or curative medicine," unquote. In 1878, AMA President Dr. T.G. Richardson of New Orleans told the members that public hygiene was, quote, "the prevention or arrest of all diseases which are not in their nature strictly limited to the individual, but which have a tendency to spread throughout communities and which cannot be otherwise controlled." A National Board of Health was created in 1879. In 1884, Bismarck's compulsory sickness scheme went into effect in Germany. It literally started a new era, a new age in the history of welfareism. Bismarck's great discovery consisted in a device for making political capital out of poverty and human suffering. Bismarck's fundamentally significant role in modern history is rarely understood. His middle-of-the-road socialism was a connecting link between the old aristocrats and the coming totalitarians. He thought he could overcome Marxism by his own brand of state socialism, just as Fabian socialists, Keynesians, and New Dealers profess that their middle-of-the-road statism keeps the totalitarian wolf from the door. Ever since Bismarck, great dictators and little demagogues compete with one another and with the humanitarians in courting the favor of the ailing, the lame, the blind, the poor, the underprivileged, and the aged. As early as 1881, Lujo Britano warned that adventuring into governmentalized medicine is the first step toward the neo-welfare state, which in turn opens up a road to national catastrophe in the long run. Now let's get back to America. From 1890 to 1920, practically all legislation had the effect of strengthening the central government, such as federal action limiting laissez-faire and monopolistic practices in business, and the individual income tax. Between 1902 and 1914, 18 states passed workmen's compensation laws. In 1906, a Pure Food and Drug Law was passed. In 1908, the Russell Sage Foundation financed a study of European social and health systems. The resulting report in 1910 aroused the interest of a great many liberals in this country. In 1910, the American section of the International Association for Labor Legislation, which was organized in 1906, espoused the health insurance cause. In 1911, the National Health Insurance Act was passed in Britain. This stimulated AMA's journal, first editorial on health insurance. It said in part, and I quote, "This law marks the beginning of the end of the old system of the individual practice of medicine and of the old relationship between the patient and physician," unquote. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party pledged itself to work increasingly for, quote, "a system of socialized insurance, including health insurance, adapted to American use," unquote. President Woodrow Wilson planned to expand the health insurance program. The war stopped his efforts. In 1912, the American Association for Labor Legislation had a committee on social insurance, which included, remember these two names, Dr. Isaac Max Rubinow, born in Russia of Jewish parentage. He was the nation's leading authority on compulsory health insurance. And Dr. Alexander Lambert, born in New York, graduated from the College of Physicians and Surgeons, was professor of clinical medicine at Cornell for 33 years. He was Teddy Roosevelt's personal physician. Rubinow and Lambert joined forces in temporarily converting AMA to a position which favored compulsory insurance. I mention these because it shows you just how few people can carry on such tremendous influence. In mid-1916, the Committee on Social Insurance of the American Association for Labor Legislation had proposed a model health insurance bill. Lambert and Rubinow participated in the committee. AMA lent its counsel to the production of the bill. The bill rejected from the first the term sickness insurance in favor of health insurance because they stressed that the main object of the act was the conservation of health. The cost of the insurance was to be borne by the employee, employer, and state. Participation was to be compulsory. The carrier was mutual association supervised by the state. There was no federal involvement proposed at this time. AMA took favorable notice of the model health insurance bill and advised physicians to study it carefully. In 1916, AMA set up its own committee on social insurance. Lambert served as chairman, Rubinow as executive secretary. This fit right in with the labor project. AMA leadership feared that some form of compulsory insurance was in the offing, backed by the government. This was in 1916. Meyer London, born in Russia, came to the United States in 1891, was in Congress from New York in the 64th, 65th, and 66th Congresses, introduced a resolution in Congress on health insurance. Rubinow spoke for the legislation. Rubinow said, and I quote, "most emphatically that in my official position as Executive Secretary of the Social Insurance Committee of the American Medical Association, I am authorized to state that the AMA is heartily in support of Mr. London's resolution and is committed to the general principle of social sickness insurance in this country," unquote. The AMA House of Delegates had not approved the position. London's resolution was never officially backed by the AMA nor opposed by the AMA. Its defeat in 1917 was due to opposition from the insurance industry and from organized labor. The defeat of the London resolution was a turning point of sorts. In 1917, Ernest Freund, professor of law in Chicago, implied that the proponents of health insurance might be pushing too hard. He further said, and I quote, "Let the advocates of health insurance agree upon a minimum program and urge the adoption of that. The well-known expansion tendency of relief legislation may be relied upon to take care of the future," unquote. In May 1917, the House of Delegates of the AMA received a massive report produced by Lambert and Rubinow, closely related to labor. spelling out the details of German experience with compulsory health insurance. And they described the transition in other countries from voluntary health insurance to schemes that were partly subsidized by the state to compulsory health insurance. The report condemned, quote, blind opposition, unquote, indignant repudiation, and bitter denunciation of compulsory health insurance laws. About this time, the war with Germany was having its effect. The political mood of the country began moving rapidly counter to earlier progressive trends. The AMA became divided into two factions, those for social insurance and those against social insurance. Those for social insurance were those prominent in academic medicine and research, and those against the great body of practitioners. The health insurance issue plus the rising tide of political reaction brought them out of isolation from their dedicated and constant application in the care of the patients. The shift to the right was initiated. In 1920, opponents of health insurance in the AMA House of Delegates obtained the approval of the following: resolved, and I quote, that the AMA declares its opposition to the institution of any plan embodying the system of compulsory contributory insurance against illness, or any other plan of compulsory insurance against illness which provides for medical service to be rendered contributors or their dependents, provided, controlled, or regulated by the federal government, unquote. In 1921, the Shepard-Towner Act became law. It provided for funds for maternal and child health. In 1922, the AMA made the following declaration, and I quote, the AMA hereby declares its opposition to all forms of state medicine because of the ultimate harm that would come to the public weal through such forms of medical practice. The state medicine is any form of medical treatment provided, conducted, or controlled, or subsidized by the federal or any state government or municipality, unquote. Dr. Ray Lyman Wilbur, president of the AMA in 1923, tried to moderate the AMA's rigid new dogma in his inaugural address, and I quote, the social relationships of medicine are so intimate and imperative that they are bound to multiply and continue. We cannot stop them by calling them Bolshevik or socialistic or pro-German, but we can guide them if we get away from the brake and begin to steer. The AMA leaders, however, for the time being, adhered tenaciously to the policies. Even the Great Depression failed to shake AMA's faith in the post-war policies. In 1930, Dr. W.G. Morgan, president of AMA, lectured to the members on paternalism. Trade unions represented a sort of paternalism. Voluntary health insurance had its paternalistic aspects. Compulsory health insurance would allow the paternalistic hand of government to throttle and degrade medical practice as it had in Germany and Britain. He also warned against the non-government paternalistic tendencies such as the mental hygiene movement. In 1932, the majority report of the Committee on Cost of Medical Care was condemned by the AMA. The committee was chaired by ex-president of AMA, Lyman Wilbur, and supported by 8 major foundations. The AMA officially endorsed a minority report. In 1934, and this is a big step, the Wilbur-Cohen area was started about this time. Wilbur-Cohen had just 2 things in mind. 1, how to get more powerful Wilbur J. Cohen, and 2, how to move America ever nearer to fully socialized medicine as an entering wedge to total socialization of the entire economy. The Liberal Time magazine on April 5, 1968 stated, in 1934, when Lyndon Johnson was a lowly aide to a lowly Texas congressman, Wilbur Cohen was busy helping to draft the law that established Social Security, a keystone for both the New Deal and the Great Society. Down the years, Cohen co-authored many other major social measures, from the 1946 Act that put federal money into the financing of new hospitals to Medicare in 1965. But even after he became Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare 3 years ago, he remained a backroom man, unquote. Marjorie Sharon, Ph.D., who had worked with Cohen, his predecessors and co-planners, had this to say of Cohen, and I quote, To gain his ends, Cohen has deceived 5 presidents regarding Social Security legislation. He has deceived Congress, pushing, manipulating, scheming, and finally in 1965 steered through Congress the bill known as Medicare, designed to nationalize medicine for 10% of the population. Labor's boy had fulfilled labor's demand without regard for the damage it would do to the health of the elderly. Quoting from Star Ledger, Newark, New Jersey, March 24, 1968, perhaps the most controversial of Cohen's prophecies involved the guaranteed income. Here's how he stated it then, quote, "By new and ingenious provisions in our private enterprise, Social Security and tax systems, the private and public sectors will be able to assure a minimum income to all who work and to all who are too sick or disabled or too old or too young to work." The AMA News reports today that Wilbur Mills has called Wilbur Cohen into consultation regarding new compulsory health programs. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt set up the Committee on Economic Security. The Medical Advisory Subcommittee was broadened to appease AMA. On August 14, 1935, a redraft of Title IV of the Economic Security Bill became law. The name was changed from Social Insurance Board to Social Security Board. It had no charge relating to health insurance. The Supreme Court decisions on cases relating to Title II of the Social Security law inferred that Congress might, whenever it is persuaded that the state of the country's general welfare required it, pass legislation guaranteeing the right to health, and it might also, by inference, use federal tax funds for the purpose. In 1935, a second model bill was drafted by the American Association for Social Security. It was called the Epstein Bill. The proposals was made public on January the 5th, 1935. It was a state measure and was to be introduced simultaneously into 43 state legislatures. It called for compulsory health insurance to be paid for by employers, employees, and the state government. American Medicine condemned it, calling it unmitigated evil. Senator Robert Wagner offered an amendment to the Social Security law, and it was called the National Health Act of 1939. It contained no provision for compulsory health insurance. American Medicine opposed it on the grounds that it would lead ultimately to complete federal control of medicine. In 1942, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Wickard versus Filburn, announced the principle that federal government could regulate anything it subsidized. Specifically, it said, "It is hardly lack of due process for the government to regulate that which it subsidizes." Here was a case of a farmer who planted 18 acres of wheat. He was only allotted 15 acres by the Secretary of Agriculture. He had no federal subsidies. He didn't market the wheat. He fed it to his chickens. He was, however, a farmer, so was subject to the rulings of the Secretary of Agriculture. And because he did not comply with these rulings, the government confiscated his property. So what is the parallel with medicine? The doctors holding the belief that they can practice medicine without regard to regulations of HEW, so long as they do not accept federal subsidies, are standing in the shadow of the rulings of the Filburn case. Thus, since the medical profession would be subsidized under national compulsory health insurance, and individual practitioners not even taking subsidies would be subject to federal regulations. This is tyranny through the back door of subsidization. This is the crux of the situation. Here is a situation of total loss of control of the money the Americans are paying as taxes. The American citizen is denied by the Supreme Court decisions any opportunity to follow his taxes through government. So when tax money is misappropriated, the American citizen cannot have any method or means to bring the government into account. In 1943, the first Murray-Wagner-Dingle proposal to create federal compulsory health insurance and federal support of medical education was proposed. It was condemned by American Medicine. In 1945, 2 years later, a second introduction of the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bill was proposed. American Medicine opposed it. And it was in 1943 that Association of American Physicians and Surgeons was organized because they felt that the AMA was not opposing the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bill properly. In 1946, the Hill-Burton bill became law, August the 13th, 1946. The House of Delegates of AMA accepted the Hill-Burton proposal, the use of federal grants in aid via the states for hospital construction. AAPS opposed it as a foot in the door of ultimate federal control of medicine. The third introduction of the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bill was presented in 1947. More health manpower, 600,000 new hospital beds, compulsory health insurance was their dig. American medicine opposed it. In 1948, the National Health Service was inaugurated in the United Kingdom, July the 5th, 1948. The National Health Service in the United Kingdom constitutes a scheme for the provision of health care services financed by compulsory tax and controlled by the government. It is a gigantic, comprehensive plan which represents one of the largest businesses in the United Kingdom and the 10th largest business in the world. It employs well over 400,000 people and costs the ratepayers approximately 5% of their gross national product, which today amounts to approximately 3,000 million pounds. And this is a quote from 1970. In 1949, the fourth and final time the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bill was introduced, American medicine opposed it. For a long time, the leading protagonist of socialized medicine throughout the world and of all steps leading to it was the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. This completely communist-dominated relic of the League of Nations planned the strategy, guided the propaganda, actually wrote the basic legislation for practically all of the nationalized health programs now in existence throughout the world. The ILO crowd even wrote the Murray-Wagner-Dingle bills for national compulsory health insurance, which were presented to the 4 out of the 5 American Congresses from 1943 through 1949. In 1949, Compulsory Medical Care and the Welfare State was a publication by Melchior Pallier, and it was published about this time. This was an analysis based on a special study of governmentalized medical care systems of the continent of Europe and in England. In this book, he makes clear how these services have been used in all countries to augment and strengthen controls by politicians and bureaucrats. In addition, he has provided insight into the origin and development of welfare state doctrine and deeds. Mr. Pallier further stated, quote, "Watching the worldwide growth of compulsory health insurance from Icelandic fishermen to coal miners in China, I noticed something that seemed to be overlooked, that all modern dictators, communists, fascists, or disguised, have at least one thing in common. They all believe in social security, especially in coercing people into governmentalized medicine," unquote. The abolishment altogether of a compulsory sickness scheme, once established, even if bankrupt and unsatisfactory, is beyond imagination. It never has happened. Governmentalized health services sooner or later run into the iron curtain of mountainous cost. The easiest way out is to curtail honoraria, denouncing the doctors as profiteers. This may or may not be true, but it is both popular and money-saving. The doctors are, of course, the key figures of governmentalized medicine. The prime purpose is to procure their services and all that goes with them. The provision of health care is the most unruly, least controllable element in public spending for the, quote, security, unquote, of the individual. Authoritarian medicine is the only branch of security system, the major function of which is to provide gratuities in kind. Of all branches of that great field of humanitarianism called social insurance, the medical is the least predictable in cost and consequences, and no other. It tends to foster, as no other, it tends to foster the very thing against which it is supposed to provide insurance. Ironically, in a world that spends more and more to combat physiological diseases, more and more psychological incentives for illness are being fostered. Another unique feature of compulsory sickness care is that it pretends and tends to offer full security of its kind. The idea underlying all other security is to give partial aid only to furnish a minimum necessary, allegedly, for existence. But in the case of medical benefits in kind, the minimum must be sufficient to restore health, which is the complete service, not just the minimum. This is what constitutes a crucial problem of every compulsory scheme. In 1952, Eisenhower was elected president, and he announced his opposition to compulsory health insurance. In 1954, Avita Culp Hobby's proposal for sponsoring health insurance risk with federal reinsurance was defeated by joint efforts of medicine and insurance. In 1956, Medicare, the Medicare Act dealing solely with dependents of the military service, became law. In 1957, Congressman Foran, Democrat of Rhode Island, introduced a bill providing hospital and medical care for the aged through Social Security. Here the stage was set for the final Medicare bill. In 1960, Kerr Mill's bill became law, September the 13th. It did not employ the Social Security mechanism in financing, and it was to be administered by the states. This was the first major medical program under the government. AMA did not oppose it. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons did oppose it. It was shown to be, as predicted by AAPS, a foot in the door for further federal control. In 1961, AMA created American Political Action Committee, known as AMPAC, to solicit funds for support of candidates who accepted AMA's views on federal health insurance legislation. In 1961, the King-Anderson bill was introduced. Like the Foran bill, it called for financing through Social Security mechanism. American medicine opposed it. In 1962, President Kennedy urged support for the King-Anderson Medicare bill in a national televised speech from Madison Square Garden. The same day, other administration spokesmen delivered similar speeches in 45 cities across the country. Dr. Ed Annis responded dramatically for AMA the next night to an empty house in Madison Square Garden. The King-Anderson bill was defeated by a very narrow margin. In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson, beholden to labor and liberal forces, became president. In 1964, the Gore Amendment, similar to the King-Anderson bill, was passed by the Senate as part of an amendment to the Social Security law. The House of Representatives declined to go along, and the Senate-House differences could not be resolved, so it failed to pass. Elder Care, an AMA proposal, which was relatively comprehensive but still excluded the Social Security financing feature, was proposed. The final result of Elder Care, passage of Public Law 8997, the present Medicare law, July the 30th, 1965. It satisfied the comprehensiveness of elder care, but the law settled solidly on Social Security financing. Liberal advocates of government-dictated medicine knew that passage of Medicare, Medicaid law, was a step toward a national health insurance program. Wilbur Cohen was a principal architect of the law. In 1966, area-wide health planning program was started. At first, this was to be voluntary area-wide health planning. However, there were soon efforts to have state legislatures to pass laws to control such planning. So, voluntary control soon became a farce. In 1967, Dr. Milford Rouse, who was a very devout AAPS member, incidentally, at that time president of AMA, warned the AMA that medicine is at the crossroads, and went on to say, and I quote, "We are faced with the concept of health care as a right rather than a privilege. We face proposals and possibilities of increased government control, an emphasis on a non-profit approach to medicine, increasing coercion, and emphasis on the academic and institutional environment." Now from 1967 to the present. At regional health programs were started by HEW. On the national scale, we have the Heart Stroke Cancer Program. On a local or state scale, there are such programs as conducted by certain schools, such as Tufts program in Mound Bayou, an all-Negro community in Mississippi, where they're spending almost $12 million, I understand, where the program is financed by grants from the federal government. And incidentally, these people that came down to Mount Bayou put out of practice the private practitioners in that area. Now, next was governmentalized subsidized group practice. Now, health maintenance organizations. Health maintenance organizations organized systems of health care, provided comprehensive services for enrolled members for a fixed prepaid annual fee. Congress' basic incentive for HMO legislation is the belief that care will be provided more economically. This seems based primarily on a reported lower rate of hospital utilization for patients of existing prepaid groups than for other financing delivery systems. The data are not conclusive, of course. It has been quite conclusively shown that HMOs will cost the enrollee more than if he paid his medical costs to the individual physician. The exception, of course, is the need for prolonged hospital care, for which protection he could get cheaper through private insurance, certainly with a deductible policy. Next, peer review organizations and peer review standards organizations are now in the forefront. Medical foundations for health care. Here, reference is made to the most specifically to a county or state medical society forming a nonprofit foundation. The foundation then sells its services to Blue Cross, Blue Shield, health insurance agent companies, and to Medicare, Medicaid carriers. As their agent, the foundation processes claims, pays physicians' fees according to a usual, customary, and reasonable schedule. Local physicians are employed to review those cases the computer rejects because of suspected fraud, abuse, overuse, or excessive fees. In addition to this, however, foundations can be modified or extended in function to a number of other ways. They can operate health maintenance organizations, and they can operate hospitals and so forth. They can do this with private money, or they can get grants from the federal government. The absolute requirement and essential for the foundation operation is peer review. At a meeting June 1971 at Hershey, Pennsylvania, the American Association of Medical Society Executives, Senator Bennett conveyed the message that physicians who feel that the medical profession will be able to operate peer review without government guidance and possibly government control will find the situation somewhat different. Here will have definite influence and review so as to assure that peer review will be carried out with the patients, the consumers, and government interests paramount. We now have arrived at national health insurance legislation, or better stated, national compulsory health insurance. And I will just mention these programs that are now being presented. MediCredit, this is an AMA proposal. National Health Insurance Standards Act, Nixon administration. Family Health Insurance Plan, Nixon administration. Health Security Act of 1971, AFL-CIO UAW, Kennedy proposal. National Health Insurance and Health Services Improvement Act, Senator Javits. National Health Care Act of 1971, Representative Burlinson. National Health Care Catastrophic Costs, Representative Hall, an MD. Catastrophic Illness Insurance Act, Senator Long. Minimum Health Benefits and Health Distribution and Education Act, Senator Pell. A Mary Plan, the American Hospital Association. The socialist bureaucrats have one thing in mind for the medical profession in this country, and that is total socialized compulsory health care. The socialist bureaucrats are determined to use total socialized medicine as a stepping stone to the complete socialization of the entire economy. It is a plan which has invariably proven to be inferior to the private free enterprise system, which gave America the greatest medical care the world has ever known. It is a plan which has invariably been more expensive than the private free enterprise system in America. And parenthetically, Senator Kennedy's scheme would cost the average American family a cool $2,000 a year in taxes and inflation. This plan for compulsory insurance is being fostered in several well-calculated, well-designed techniques. Basically, it goes something like this. First, the main thrust of all publicity in a deliberately distorted and biased disparagement of the medical profession and its services is to convince the public that some kind of crisis exists. The socialists learned a long time ago that they can get away with all kinds of schemes and legislation and increases in size and power in government, which the public would otherwise not accept, if these measures are inaugurated under the pretense that they are required by some emergency. Much discussion about a crisis in medicine is heard today. Political opportunists and the bias of the mass media have manufactured this issue to further their own ends. But there is, in fact, a crisis extant in America whose true nature is not clear to most people. America and the medical profession face a conflict between freedom and collectivism, and not just a crisis about providing medical care. Now, the second of these movements, one of the complaints now being so continuously hammered into the public consciousness, is that there is an increasing shortage of physicians. This is a bit of misleading propaganda. There is no shortage of physicians. The United States probably has more qualified physicians per capita than any country in the world. The real problem is overutilization and misuse of the doctor's time, a condition that can only be made worse by any type of bureaucratic intervention. And how will it get worse? Fewer able-bodied and intelligent men will study medicine. Why 8 or 10 or 12 years preparation and then be converted into salaried government clerks instead of independent practitioners of a noble profession? Parenthetically, each year, Britain loses the equivalent of up to 30% of its medical school graduates to Canada, Australia, and the United States. The third of these propaganda line proposals is that the world's wealthiest nation is far from being the healthiest. Who says so? By whose statistics or by what criteria is the quality of a nation's health measured? How much of the phony hogwash about mental health is in these appraisals? With ever advancing socialism in Sweden has proven debilitating. The U.S. News and World Report on February the 7th, 1966 revealed that alcoholism, suicide, and venereal disease are among the highest, if not the highest, in the Western world. Crime is spiraling and welfare demands are proving to be insatiable in Sweden. Swedes now pay a staggering 20% of their taxes for socialized health care, the highest in the world. Fourth, that is the next propaganda line, that America is spending 5 times as much for health as it spent 20 years ago. How much of this is due to massive bureaucracy, to bungling, and to provocation, to malingering that go with Medicare, to Medicaid? How much is due to inflation? How much is due to the rapid growth of our population? And the fifth, it is proclaimed that other Western nations have long since solved the problem with national health insurance. Yes, just as they are gradually solving the problem of poverty among some segments of their people by making poverty far more universal for almost the total population. One thing above all is certain: without doctors, there is no health care. Bad, good, systematized, non-systematized, solo, group, fee-for-service, salaried, or capitated. None. People concerned with the improvement of health care turn as instinctively to government as a babe turns to its mother's breast. Oddly, it is expected that a government composed of politicians and civil service employees, which has made a fudge of the public school system, a mockery of charity in the form of welfare, which cannot provide adequate housing for the rat-infested, which demands ever-increasing taxes for ever-decreasing social services, which periodically becomes hopelessly involved in a destructive war, which at times ignores the constitutionality guaranteed civil liberties of its citizens, which can cope neither with inflation nor unemployment, which made a complete botch of Medicaid, which is totally incapable of coping with traffic, let alone crime in the streets, and which takes 11 days to deliver a special delivery letter a distance of 1 mile in the economic capital of the nation, can nonetheless produce the miracles of an Aesculapius. If Americans were given their full salaries or income, and it was their responsibility to go by the government window and pay their Social Security tax as well as other taxes, they would balk and stop this runaway bureaucratic giveaway madness. The individual never sees his full salary. The taxes are withheld. He becomes adjusted and looks upon his take-home pay as his salary. He certainly needs to be awakened. He needs to know what price he is paying for Social Security, for Medicare, for Medicaid, and what he will pay for compulsory health insurance. In closing, let me quote again from Polyer's book, published in 1949. During the past few years, most Americans have begun to comprehend that vast revolutionary forces are in ferment in this country. It must be understood that the establishment and its extension of welfare concepts and mechanisms lead to an inevitable end. If implemented here, they would ultimately mean for America the blind confusion that is in Europe, the tragic austerity that is in England, and the godless despair that is Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moorehead.